All right, so as I was saying, thank you for the invitation. And, I feel like an outlier. So basically, this is a paper with Pablo Veramendi at Duke and Daniel Stegmuller also at Duke. And basically, this is a paper that is about engaging with a literature that has grown on backsliding, and we want to push back against this literature. And I guess that in some way may be of help to, I hope, to people that are working on AI and automation in some sense. Basically, there is this literature, as you probably are aware, that claims that democracies around the world are in a process of backsliding, and that we have gone through beyond the peak of liberal democracies at the turn of the 21st century. And we are not convinced by this position. So in the paper, what we do is that we want to engage with this literature by doing two things. One is by basically decoupling democratic backsliding from a democratic breakdown. We think it's good to consider these as two different moments in the life of democracies, or the possibilities of having democratic regimes. And also, we want to, instead of starting by looking at the last decade, trying to take a view that it goes back in time, basically starting in the 20th century. And when we look at the data, this is the proportion of failed democracies, and from 1900 till our times, what we see is a clear process of democratic breakdown in the interwar period, and then after decolonization. But really, perhaps there has been some backsliding, but not to the point of a democratic breakdown. So part of the literature on democratic backsliding, and perhaps that's why we are a bit, the authors and myself, a bit anxious about this literature, is this idea that there are these politicians that somehow, well, there are different stories, but one of them is that somehow they have stirred up a bunch of resentments, and they have used all these things to reduce democracy and conspire to reduce democracy. And in a way, this is something we, the first part of the assumption is that with this quote from Jaworski is that, the dream of politicians is to hold on to power forever, right? So that's, I guess, in their genetic structure of things, but we do not see a democratic backsliding happening everywhere all the time. So what we want is to think about exactly what is going on, and we do this by combining three literatures. One, we want to put together the electoral policy incentives of incumbents. We want to think a bit more about that. We use, so Nancy Bermeo was, I guess, as far as I know, the first to introduce the concept of democratic backsliding. And we use also a more formal stuff from Milan Zvolik. And to put it together with redistributive theories of democracy that allow us to consider how incumbents, politicians operate in an environment that has some bones to it. And then behind this, and I added this line so to speak to this crowd, that contra what would be the typical linear modernization theory, where you have growth and as a result, a happy ending with countries democratizing. In the paper, we sort of hint at the idea that the structure of inequality and income are very much, or perhaps in some way, determined by what we think is a set of capital-labor complementarities, so that it really depends on the ways in which production is organized. This has an impact on different types of labor, and this has an impact on income and inequality in such a way that it reflects, to some extent, on the possibilities of having a democracy. And I'll go back to this later on. So basically, the theory is kind of simple. We just borrow from political economy a Meltzer-Richards, Tom Romer model, where you have a mass of individuals that vary in income. There is a proportional income tax imposed on them, and there's it distributed to individuals. And the tax of individuals, the one that is optimal to each one of them, is going to fall with their income. But the welfare loss that comes from these increasing taxes declines with income basically because of the declining marginal utility of income. In this setup, there are elections happening. There are two candidates. We call them H and L, the high taxes and the low taxes candidates that are, can think of, citizens that are drawn from a distribution with some probability. They have their own policy positions, which leads to a partial convergence on taxes and redistribution. And then one of them is the incumbent, and the incumbent is going to choose some level of electoral manipulation to the point that this is still something that allows the incumbent to win, so to keep the decisive voter in line. And so the level of toleration, the level of manipulation that the income is going to choose to win elections or to manipulate elections is going to be determined by the distance of the policy platforms. So as a result of combining the two things, as you have more inequality, there's going to be an increase in policy polarization, which is going to lead to an increase in the possibility and the likelihood of non-democratic strategies. But at the same time, with rising income, because they are attenuating basically the tax welfare losses, this backsliding is going to be moderated by growth or by being a richer country. In the paper, we do some historical examination of all this by looking at basically how these economies, these industrial capitalist economies, have sort of in a stylized way evolved, and what is the correlation with, or what is the how many times you see democratic breakdowns. We sort of think about the evolution into last 200 years as going through three sort of periods. One would be the first industrial revolution, where basically unskilled labor is complementary to capital, high levels of inequality, difficulty or impossibility of making possible to reconcile democracy and capitalism. A second industrial revolution with the assembly line, the complementarity of capital is or semi-skilled labor is complementary to capital. This attenuates income inequality. There is also growth. And so that's where democratic capitalism regimes flourish and become consolidated by the late 20th century. And then the last period where, because of the technological transformations that we have been discussing for the last 2 days, of which AI is just one of them, the labor that becomes complementary to capital is kind of high-skill labor. So this has perhaps, led. So there is a discussion about exactly the causes of inequality, but we claim that, it sort of leads to a higher levels of inequality. But the difference between the sort of first period of high inequality and our period is this change in income levels that we think attenuates the possibility of democratic breakdowns. We then collect data from 1900 till 2019, basically the Madison data, and then we construct a total inequality index that relies on the Ansel-Samuels measures of rural inequality for the agricultural sector, and then the income inequality for the rest of the economy. And the first step in our analysis is basically to look at the symptoms of this democratic malaise, so democratic backsliding. We do a bunch of estimations. Here I'm showing on the left side so we use BDEM, and we use a set of measures of democratic backsliding. The first one is the extent to which losers fail to consent to elections. We estimate in a linear model with two-way fixed effects, country year observations, the impact, the marginal effect of inequality. Here is by GDP. So basically for low levels of per capita income, inequality has a positive and statistically significant effect on the on losers not consenting to democracy, for much higher levels of per capita income. Inequality doesn't have this effect. So we think a moderating effect of income. We also try alternative measures of what we would consider like symptoms of democratic backsliding, such as free elections, media freedom, judicial constraints, all of these things taken from BDEM. BDEM has problems, but also has some important strengths that are worth exploiting. From there, we go into an examination of the survival of democracy, basically looking at it with proportional hazard models. The left-hand side plot shows what is the effect on democratic survival of a one standard deviation change of the two variables, inequality and GDP per capita, on the survival of democracy. The effect of inequality is negative. The effect of income is positive in our estimations. And on the right, what you see is the case of a country where inequality is set to the 90th percentile in the distribution of inequalities in the world, with those two possibilities: a high-income country and a country with the GDP per capita, the median. And even though the two cases are a high inequality, the developed country has a much stable democracy, and survival is granted for this long period that we plot. This is using the same models by grids. Here is the axis is log GDP from low income to high income, and here from low inequality to high inequality. And we plot the probability of a democratic breakdown, so it looks like a mountain, with very low levels of democratic likelihood of democratic breakdown for a combination of high income and low inequality. But when you go to poor, unequal countries, the probability of democratic breakdown is very high. So I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to go right into the conclusions of this. So basically, in the paper, we think about democratic backsliding and democratic breakdown mostly as a continuum. And what we find is that inequality certainly destabilizes democratic regimes, may lead for high levels to the breakdown. Income seems to moderate the effect of inequality. And in our paper, at least, it seems that the interaction of both factors is behind the stability that we observe, in spite of the tensions and the symptoms of things that are not working as they should, the stability of democratic regimes in these countries. Our paper also tries to, in a way, at the end, talk about democracy in America. So there is all this literature on how democracies die that seem to paint this very gloomy vision of the US. But in fact, we interpret what is going on as in an opposite way, right? So the democracy expanded in the US in the 1960s by the expansion of civil rights to Black Americans. Black Americans in the economic or in the income distribution are at the lower level, at the bottom. So this means that with this, more, wider franchise, naturally there is going to be more political strife and polarization. And so it's not surprising that as these populations are brought into full democracy, there might be tensions going on, right? On top of this first sort of democratizing wave that leads mechanically to a broader income distribution of those that vote, We have on top of that the emergence of digital technologies and globalization with all the effects that we have been discussing. And so those two things together may explain why perhaps democracy looks, like in contention, but that's precisely because the past was less democratic than today. Now, what about the future? So is this time different? Perhaps, we don't know. We are examining, or people have been examining things that are just starting, so we are not sure about whether they are going to happen, at what pace they are going to happen, with what effects over who they are going to be having an effect. So far, the things that, just to point one thing, is that in spite of the crisis of the late 2000s, early 2010s, the Great Recession was basically, didn't lead to the collapse of anything like the Great Depression. And to us, this indicates a system where democracy compensates losers, but also can compensate losers because there are these levels of income that allow for this compensation to happen. Now, is this compensation going to be there at the level necessary to reduce the tensions that may come from these technological changes? We really do not know. So there may be a technological acceleration that may result in job dislocations and wage shocks that we may not be able to manage. And the second thing is that the paper really takes a very specific form. It's a very political economy paper that is based on mostly a one-dimensional story where the economy is fundamental. But of course, you can throw in other dimensions of conflict, like climate change, or like cultural and social conflict. And in that case, it may exacerbate the conflict in such a way that, in fact, may not be possible to compensate in any way. And so these may lead to democracy. So we are not saying we are writing an optimistic paper, but we realize that you can basically decompose in a postmodern way the paper to go somewhere else, right? Thank you. Should I sit here?
It's so rare to have an optimistic paper in the field of democratic backsliding. Yeah, that's right, in the field of pessimists.
Oh, real quick question. No, you're not done yet. On your conclusions, is it possible that the word moderates, as far as income moderates inequality, is a bit of an understatement, given the significant growth in wealth in the past century globally? Just a thought. I'm assuming you chose that word carefully. My impression would be that wealth growth has been so significant relative to inequality that it might be a panacea for any tensions.
Further question? Oh, we got one here.
Yeah, my first question is, why do you operationalize inequality as asset inequality with the rural genie? That seems to be assets versus the income inequality, which is the Meltzer-Richard motive force. The dynamo is the income inequality difference versus the average. And then second, I wonder if you could exploit shocks and technological acceleration in your data set that are historical. So in the industrialized countries, you could look at the advent of the steam engine versus electrification versus the microprocessor revolution in the early 70s. And then with the Komen data set, COMIN, on technological diffusion, there's data on diffusion in developed and developing countries. And maybe you could look at whether the interaction of acceleration with your other factors explains some of the timing or clustering of breakdowns, since you have so much data, and that Komen data is historical too. As I recall, it goes back to like the early 20th century. So that could be neat. Thanks.
Okay, so my comment might not be that fair because you mentioned at the end of your presentation about some of the variables that you're ignoring in the argument. Should I start it over?
Yeah, somehow,
Yeah, no, that's okay. So you said at the end of your presentation that you're ignoring some of the variables that might matter for democratic backsliding. The question that I have is sort of along those lines, so it might not be very fair for your arguments, but the question is, first, you mentioned at the beginning about the effect of election, candidates trying to complain that the election was not fair, or maybe we were. So it wasn't clear to me how you're defining the democratic breakdown. Is it only claiming that the election was not fair and trying to stay in power, or is it actually when the opposition win the election and do not take power because people do not hand over? So that's the first. The second comment is, if the definition has to do with the first one, claim about the election being not fair or being fraudulent, the argument then is electoral justice or the electoral courts are crucial in many countries. So if you have an independent system of judiciary independent, that they take care of election, they actually organize the results, all the process, and it's an independent branch of the government, then you have to factor that element in, because it might going to affect how people are more likely to accept the results or not, and also, in a worst case scenario, actually accept the results of the election and have a transition of power for the opposition. Yeah, that's my comment.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I took this off, but I guess you hear me, right? So going to the last points first. The difference between the backsliding and democratic breakdown, basically democratic breakdown is that there is no turnover in government. So there are elections and then suddenly there are not competitive elections anymore, and there is no turnover in government. So that's basically it. In terms of backsliding, we use a bunch of different measures. I don't think we use the independence of the electoral court, but it would be interesting to see if BDEM has that, and we could plug this in and see if there have been changes in the institutional structure to measure backsliding. I think that's a very cool idea, Victor's idea about exploiting technological shocks. We are looking at democratic breakdown, so it would be, there is this technological shock, it happens. We would have to think about to what extent, so it would not be just technological shock per se, but, what are the kinds of labor that win from that? And then we could exactly examine this thing. So that's a great idea. So what we do is that we basically have asset inequality in the rural areas under the assumption that returns to assets are homogeneous. We have also run all these things only with income inequality, and there is no difference. My co-authors insist on these two measures,
I would push back, because if you think about taxing rural land,
Yeah.
that doesn't map up the notes for Richard, which is you have a turnkey tax authority that can go and tax people proportionally and then redistribute. With land, it just seems impossible. Or not impossible, but really hard, which is why a lot of countries where the most important asset is land seem to be perpetually unequal, and it seems like the tax authorities are just not able to.
Well, but that's why they are not democratic, right? Because, I would, go against that in the sense that because these assets are fixed and somehow they can be measured even eyeballing these assets, those that are the holders, the owners of these assets, block the change in democracy to democracy to avoid being expropriated or taxed in some way. But again, we only look at democratic breakdowns here. We do not really look at transitions to democracy, which is a different story. So on the first point, in our model, basically, what happens is that high-income earners care less about high taxes, especially if they are very rich, right? So they can, and we had some quotes in the paper that we took out on Gates and others saying, I'm happy to be taxed on my last billion, and which goes into this model. Now, so that's one thing. The second thing is so perhaps I'm doing two things here. One is the model itself and the incentives of high income earners to accept being taxed. And the second thing is what I said at the end, which is with these societies, when they are rich, you have enough wealth or whatever to then tax and compensate. They are the same thing, but they do not. So formally in the paper, the second thing doesn't show up.
Hi. This is cool. I guess my questions are they're non-conceptual, just in the spirit of, it seems to me like you should be pushing your data a little harder to see whether these results hold up. So I'm just looking at the two-way fixed effect model. I haven't looked at any of the other things, but I guess a couple things. I guess I would rather see the two-way fixed effect model with, a linear time trend interacted with your treatment variables than random controls thrown in and see whether it holds up, and that would be more reassuring on parallel trends. I also think at the very least your standard errors should be clustered at the country level, and probably they should be 2A clustered at the country and the year level, given the way we think about inequality over time and the way we think. So I just think there's some more. I'd be interested to know how robust it is and how hard it is to break the results. And so I just think you've got amazing data, and so it'd be nice to know.
Okay.
Yotam?
Thank you. Very interesting. So question, from some studies that we have from recent years, primarily about backsliding, the evidence seems to be that, at least from public opinion story, is that polarization is doing a lot of the work. So that when you've got a highly polarized public, then people are willing to turn a blind eye to certain steps that the government is pursuing that is weakening democracy, sort of backsliding, and maybe all the way to breakdown. And my question is whether you think that part of what you're finding here about inequality is that basically inequality is capturing something about social divisions in society that then generate this kind of polarization that then allow leaders to pursue certain types of efforts to undermine democracy.
We've got one more question.
Thanks. I wonder if this is just a story about stability of democracies or a story about stability of political regimes in general. In other words, do income and inequality function similarly for the stability of both democratic and authoritarian regimes?
Anyone else? If not, we'll go back to Carlos.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Making me work today.
I'm sorry if this was addressed yesterday. I missed yesterday, but I'm wondering, we're looking at internal factors, and what about external interference in democracies? How important is that in terms of current political climate? And are we looking at that as an important factor for our future democracy here?
Yeah, thank you. There are great comments and questions. So on the data, so think we'll implement this, or on Yotam's question, yeah. So basically, the idea is that behind this polarization in our model, inequality is doing the work. But as I said at the end of the paper, you can think of polarization also as generated by other things. And so in that sense, the paper perhaps doesn't say, I mean, if you believe the paper, it doesn't tell you much about the other part, right? But if I remember correctly, because we have a very long appendix, we also plug in polarization as a measure to see the prediction of the extent to which there is democratic breakdown, and it works. So it's all about stability of democracies, not about all regimes. And as for international factors, we do not deal with that. I have done this in other places, and it, that's a different story. But you could, enter these, say, in a, and so because there is a cost, there is a manipulation cost in this case, in this paper, right? But it could be done in different ways. This manipulation may also be a function, I would think of it as a function of monitoring by other countries, by international institutions. And so to the extent that you have a certain type of international regime that is, let's say, with a democratic hegemon, things are going to be more difficult than if you have a bunch of authoritarian countries outside that may sort of help you in the manipulation, right? So we do not do this. We do not look at different moments that you could do this through. It would be we could try to do this like diffusion. So there are diffusion models of democracy that are related, to neighbors and so on and so forth, or differences in international regimes over the long period of time we examine.
Thank you.
Sure.